Hey everyone, so my name is Nick Randolph, and I run a consulting company called Built to Roam. And so just tonight's session is going to be focusing on the Uno platform. But if you need to get hold of me outside of this, then obviously my Twitter handle, my email address that I'll throw in the chat window as well. Yeah. So tonight's session, as we dig deep into the Uno platform, the concept of this WinUI Everywhere will come up a few times. Essentially, there's a long story of sort of XAML and .NET development that Microsoft's had, dating back from the likes of Silverlight and WPF days, and all the way through the sort of the mobile space that Microsoft worked in for a while. Windows 8, and then obviously UWP is one of their sort of latest incarnations. And the XAML language that's been used there has now been sort of extracted out from the operating system and is now available as this thing called WinUI. And the idea behind the Uno platform is that whilst Microsoft provides a solution for the Windows platform, other platforms need to benefit from having the wonders of XAML and C# code, which is where the Uno platform comes in. And so they deliver an abstraction that allows you to use the same code base for all sorts of different platforms. So that's the focus of tonight's session. And as we get into it, we're going to start off talking a little bit more about the problem domain and how it impacts software developers and the way that we build apps. And so historically, a lot of people have just been building Windows apps, so Windows Forms or WPF, or you might be coming from having an iOS app or an Android app, and you start looking at the other platforms that you want to target. And all of a sudden, you're faced with this challenge of having to duplicate the effort that you put in to create those apps. And so, you start looking around for these sort of cross-platform technologies, technologies that are going to reduce the amount of not just the amount of development effort, but the sort of the maintenance effort and the challenges that go with that as well. There's also the challenge of trying to make sure that the individual platforms are all consistent, so the app behaves consistently on every single platform. And that's again a challenge if you're going to be building individually for each of the platforms, because you need to make sure that the approach to each problem is the same, the solution's the same, and the behavior of the app is going to be the same across all those platforms. So this again leads us down the path of having a sort of a singular technology where we can produce apps for all of these platforms. The second challenge is that there is a long history of .NET-based, Windows Forms and WPF apps and web apps. And to try and deliver a native experience across, various platforms does kind of require an extensive rewrite if you're going to pick a technology that's not in the .NET ecosystem. So one of the things that Uno brings to the table is the fact that we're working in the same .NET ecosystem that historically you would have built a Windows app or a web app in. And so you can leverage the fact that you'll reuse the code that you have for those apps and avoid, rewriting at least a part of your app. The third challenge is that skills are obviously difficult to come by into certain areas or expensive. And if you need to build for every individual platform you want your app to target, all of a sudden you're going to have to build up teams that specialize in iOS or specialize in Android. And all of a sudden you need to maintain those teams and, provide incentives and training and it becomes very difficult to if you've got a single app to then have a dedicated team for each of those platforms. And again, being able to have a single platform or a single technology that you do the bulk of your development in means that you can centralize those developer resources, focus on that one technology, and then sort of use that to target all of the different platforms. So let's dig into the solution. So essentially the Uno platform, as I mentioned at the beginning, doesn't really do anything in the Windows space. I mean, essentially the Windows offering there is provided by Microsoft. So that is WinUI packaged with the Windows App SDK. There are some components that sit above that we'll talk about that the Uno do deliver for Windows, but the core runtime is basically is the offering for Microsoft. Where the Uno platform kicks in is being able to support all of those other platforms you want to target, from the web all the way through down to your Linux devices or your IoT devices. Basically anywhere that can run .NET is the goal of the Uno platform. It is a single code base, which basically means that you build your UI and your code once. So you write it in your UI in XAML or code, and your business logic in code, and you compile it, and it can be run on any of these different individual platforms. There's also, because it's in .NET, we do have a third-party ecosystem. So again, it's all of the tooling and technology and the ecosystem that you're used to. So if there's a NuGet package for .NET Standard, for example, you can just bring that into your application and it will just be available across all of the different platforms. The other areas that we're going to touch on later in the session are sort of the platform part of the UNO offering. And so these are things like the Figma plugin, the VS Code integration, and some of the extension packages that we've been working on to make it easier for app developers to rapidly build out applications. It's worth noting that there are obviously different offerings in the market that take different approaches to this cross-platform problem. And you'll see that UNO kind of fits in the middle between the sort of the canvas rendering options and the native rendering options. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so if we take the native rendering options, we're really looking at things like React Native and Xamarin Forms or .NET MAUI. And essentially the practice there is that they take the default controls from the platform and they reskin them and make them available they provide an abstraction on top of them to build out the applications. But essentially, they're using those underlying controls with some styling applied to those. On the other hand, the canvas rendering options, so for example, Avalonia and Flutter are the two sort of ones that come to mind, although I would put the caveat that Flutter isn't obviously a .NET technology. And so their approach to this cross-platform is that each device represents a vanilla canvas or a blank canvas, and they are responsible for doing everything. So everything from rendering to the accessibility side of things to all of that stuff. That essentially the rendering platform is taken care of. And so obviously there's some pros and cons of those. Obviously from the canvas rendering side, you get infinitesimally close control over what actually gets produced, but the framework is responsible for doing everything. And so there are some scenarios there where you don't get the default platform behavior. So it may be the bounce at the bottom of a scrolling list, for example, may not represent what's not there by default on the platform. On the flip side, the native rendering ones, obviously you get a lot of those built-in control capabilities from the platform. So for example, the text entry, because it's using the native control, there's no additional stuff that the technology needs to do on top of that. On the flip side, the challenge there is that you need to then provide an abstraction for styling all of these controllers, because each of the native controllers has a different way of being styled. In the middle is kind of where the UNO platform sits. They do make use of the native controllers to do a lot of the rendering work, but for certain technologies, they also have a canvas-based solution. The big thing about the UNO platform that kind of sets it apart from some of the other technologies is this concept of lookless or control templating. So lookless controls are ones where you have a definition of the behavior of control that's independent of the way the control looks and has been styled. So for example, a combo box on Windows, if you restyle it, will still function as a sort of a drop-down select an item type control. Irrespective of how you go about templating it or change the look and feel of it, it still exhibits the same behavior. And so that's something that's really important, because it does mean that as you style controls to suit your application, you have very fine-grained control over how the controls look without having to worry about necessarily breaking the functionality of those controls. All right, so we're getting into a little bit of code here. So here we have a snippet of XAML that does a very basic layout that shows a text block and a slider, and the two have been sort of data bound together. Now we'll show this in a little bit of practice in a minute, but you can see how here the rendering across all these platforms is very similar, if not identical. Okay, the goal for the UNO platform is pixel perfect, and obviously because they are still using the underlying controls, there are some times where there are some bleed through from the underlying control, but on the whole, the goal is for this pixel perfect rendering so that you get the same look and feel, same behavior across all of the target platforms. And as you can see from the slide, we're almost running out of space on here. So, we've got Linux on the left all the way through to macOS and Catalyst. We've got WebAssembly, Android, Windows, iOS, just to name a few. But let's actually drop into code and take a look at some of this. So let's bring up some code and close that. And we're actually going to start off at the command prompt and actually use .NET New to generate an Uno app. There are Visual Studio templates that you can get, so you can go into the Visual Studio Marketplace, install the Uno extensions, and that will give you Visual Studio templates. But because we're actually going to start in VS Code, I'm actually going to start walking through from the command line. And just trigger it this way. So .NET New Uno app, you do need to install the .NET New templates that are available from NuGet, and then the Uno app is the sort of the getting started app here. It's basically the simplest form of app that you can create. So let's go ahead and create that. Just one note that the VS Code flag on the end of here basically just sets up the deployment and the debugging files specific to VS Code. So if you're using Visual Studio, you may not want those options. So you can see here that it's going ahead and creating the various projects. And it's called .NET Restore on those. And once we're done, we can then launch that with code. And the first thing we should note, and again, I've installed the Uno extensions into VS Code, but because this is a .NET solution, you will get a prompt saying that, hopefully, that there are projects that need restoring, and would like to go ahead and do those. So we'll go ahead and restore those, and so you'll see, .NET Restore kicking in again to basically set up these projects. To set up the debugging experience, I mentioned that the debugging files have already been created as part of that VS Code flag. And so all we need to do actually is pick the target. So we're going to start off by deploying and debugging the WASM experience. And then we should be able to just hit F5 and we should start to see the debugging experience kicking in. So in the debug console, you'll actually see it using .NET Run. And let's go and pick a source code file, and I'll just put a breakpoint in here so you can see it actually being invoked as our page is rendered. Okay, so page has already been rendered, so let me just restart the app by just pressing refresh in the browser, and our breakpoint is hit. And for those who are familiar with sort of the XAML space and worked with WPF or Windows, the kind of folder structure of this shared project will be fairly familiar. So you've got an app.xaml, which represents sort of the application or the entry point for the application, and then you've got your first page or your main page of the application. And so here, where we've got the debugging breakpoint set, this is on the onLaunched event. And it allows you to do things like hover over and see variable values. You can obviously step through using the standard debugging experience. I'm actually going to let that run, and we're going to hop over to this main page XAML, and we'll show how we can tweak that in a little bit. Let's actually see the application running. Okay, it's hello world. That corresponds to this XAML that we've seen in here. Just a little bit of a note to the project or solution structure. So the default template represents an Uno app that is targeting Net6 and is available for mobile, so iOS, Android, and Mac Catalyst, using this single mobile solution. Okay, so this is a .NET 6 project. If I click on the solution file, you can see that. So it's .NET 6 targeting these various .NET 6 platforms. The other projects that are in here represent the other targets that you can build your app for. So Skier, WPF, WASM, and Windows. Now, if you're comparing this to Maui actually includes Windows into the mobile project, and we can probably foresee that the Uno platform will do that at some point in the near future. But for the time being, it's broken off to be kept separate. And then, so let's just dig into the shared project. I mean, I mentioned that this has got your standard app files, but this is essentially where the source code for all of your app is going to reside. You don't really need to touch the other project files unless you want to set them as the startup project, or you want to go and customize things like the splash screen or the icons and things like that for those individual platforms. Anyway, let's go back to our XAML for a second, and let me just zoom this in a little bit. Oh, it's code. There we go. Okay, so we've got our text block. Let's go ahead and add in a slider. Now you'll notice that we are continuing to run the application, so we're not actually stopping it. And we're going to add in a slider, give it a name. close that, and we'll set up the data binding like we saw in the slides. So we just do binding value and element name equals slider. Okay, so essentially that's a data binding to the slider element, and we're going to be binding on the value property of the slider. So hopefully, as we save that, when we go back to our web experience, we should see that update. It says, yes, okay, so for some reason the hot reload is not working. Let's go and retry that. We should see that load in a second. A bit lucky because it's a sidebar. There we go. And it allows you to drag and drop. Now, what should have happened is that those should have actually, when I save the file, it should have actually automatically reloaded them. So let's just change the order of those and see whether it's actually going to make a difference. I don't think it is. Let's just boost the font size on this and see whether that changes too. Yeah, okay, so it's starting to make some changes now. So that's boosted up in the font size. So the hot reload has kicked in for that. Now, the next thing we're going to do is actually switch over and show the GTK, so essentially the Linux build. Now, remembering that I'm actually running on Windows, so being able to do this is pretty cool. And so this basically makes use of the WSL to basically build and run the application. Okay, so this is a Linux app running on Windows with a full debugging experience from VS Code. Okay, so it's exactly the same code that we just had running for WASM. Now, as we get into it, I'll also show some of the other targets, but for the time being, we'll hop back to the slides. So let's do that. So just a bit of back history on the UNO platform for those who are interested. It has been around for quite some time. So back in 2013 was when it sort of kind of was the inception, with the sort of the first real version available in 2018, and its deployment as an open source project, along with things like WebAssembly sort of made its first kind of appearance. And over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen subsequent releases for sort of version 2, version 3, and then last year we saw the release of version 4, which is currently the major version that we're kind of working to. And version 4 saw with it both the support for .NET 6, but also a number of these sort of platform-ish experiences like the Toolkit, Figma plugin, VS Code, and the extensions modules that we've been working on. So the UNO platform is there's a free and publicly available set of source code you can take, and the support basically is available as a paid sort of enterprise kind of model. If you want to make sure that you've got a support model in place for it, and I think this is kind of one of the big differentiators from something like Maui, even though people would argue that Maui is like a first-party experience. The advantage of a UNO platform is that if you do want that sort of guarantee that there's going to be a support mechanism there, there is this sort of paid support mechanism. Not to mention the fact that UNO is a very active open source library, and basically everything, whether it be the core platform or the toolkits and the extensions, they're all done in the open. Okay, so the source code for those additional things are also open source. Microsoft is actually UNO's largest source code contributor. So a lot of the core platform, whether it be UWP or WinUI, the team have used the actual underlying source code for that to generate the abstractions for the other platforms. So for example, if you look at things like the datetime picker, there's a very high amount of reuse available there to make sure that that same experience is delivered across the various other platforms. If you're looking at other sort of third-party controls, there's a whole bunch of net standard libraries. So, for any library there's truly a net standard library, that can just be dropped in and will actually work. And as we now move into sort of the .NET 6 era, any .NET 6 library will also work across those various targets. So there's a bit of consensus there. One thing I would note about the .NET standard libraries is where there are platform-specific components, those will need to make sure that they're available for the individual platform. So, for example, one of the stumbling blocks at the moment is there's a .NET standard library that Microsoft produced for doing authentication with Azure AD, so the MSAL library, and that technically is a net standard library that's got different implementations for the various underlying platforms, and right now that's broken for Net 6, so none of your mobile targets will work. Only the desktop one will work for Net 6 as they get around to adding support for things like .NET MAUI and obviously Uno for Net 6 targets. So there is a bit of a gotcha there where there are platform-specific components there. Third-party controls, there's a number of sort of the control libraries that are available for the Uno platform. I'm a big fan of what the live charts guys have been doing, but there are other stuff from Infragistics and Syncfusion that's available for the Uno platform as well. And lastly, there's a number of the presentation frameworks, so also known as sort of MVVM style frameworks. So Prism and React UI are both available for Uno as well. For example, if you want to look at the Infragistics controls, this is some of the different controls and grids that they have available, and they render pretty much identically across all of the various target platforms. I mentioned at the beginning that one of the big areas of investment for the Uno team is around sort of this productivity and sort of the platform part of it. So the phrase was that the V4 release really put the platform back in Uno platform. And so there's a move there to obviously continue support the underlying core platform and make sure that that's available for all of the different targets. But now to actually start work on some of the components that make it easier for everything from design all the way through to deployment of apps is that it made that much simpler and easier to do. So if we get started, we'll look at design, and this is a common problem that we see when building apps. In fact, anytime we're building software where there's been some designers involved, there's this handover where design stops and sort of the developers get either sort of static images or they get, you know, a sort of an exported set of information from the design documents. And this handoff is typically very error prone. Not only is it hard for the developers to work out exact measurements and how that translates to the app, they also don't understand the necessary things like animations and transitions and all of those types of things that the design or the designer had intended, but it's hard to communicate to the actual developer. On the flip side, there are a number of tools out there that do this whole sort of design generated code. And so, you know, there's things like the Power Platform and stuff like that, where designers can go in there and actually pull together the look and feel of the app, generate an actual working app for various platforms. The limit here is that those tend to be very opinionated. They tend to be a little bit rigid, and so they do typically provide some form of extensibility. But in terms of truly styling the app and being able to add custom controls and things like that, they are somewhat rigid and hard to adapt. And so designers feel very constrained when they're trying to build using those tools. Now, hopefully what the Uno platform is delivering is somewhere in the middle of there. So they recognize that, you know, designers spend a lot of time in their preferred tools, so things like Figma. And if there's a way that we can then take what they've done and actually generate the bulk of the code, then that's obviously a bonus. And given that the whole Uno platform, including the Windows side of things, is based on XAML, it would seem sensible for us to generate that XAML. And the nice thing, because it's completely abstracted away from any of the sort of source code, it means that it sort of allows that round tripping of code. So, you know, as the designs change, you could regenerate the XAML and actually just drop it basically into the app without having to make many, if any, changes. So the Figma support is two parts. There is a component library that we'll look at in a second, and this plugin that allows you to sort of generate the XAML from what you've designed. And so the upshot there is that we're generating the XAML, and this should handle things like not just the layout of the page, but it should handle things like localization and, you know, where we should be applying that. Things like reactive extensions and navigation and accessibility should all be handled from Figma and driven down using the XAML export. Okay, so here's a very short video that actually kind of shows the template in action. We'll just play that for a few minutes. A few seconds once it kicks in. It kicks in. Okay, maybe it's not going to get there. Anyhow, we're going to drop into Figma and have a look at it anyhow. So let's just pause that. And so here's a screenshot of the Figma design experience for those who are familiar with it. And the idea there is that on the left here, you've got your design, and then you've got the plugin that's able to generate the corresponding XAML for that plugin. So without much ado, let's actually switch over and we'll actually load up some Figma. Let's actually grab my Figma document. So this is the Uno Platform Material Toolkit that's freely available. You can go launch Figma and go search for it, and then you basically generate a copy or a clone of the toolkit that you can then get started with. There's some initial getting started instructions, and in fact from here you can actually do things like vary the various platform colors or the default colors that you want to make use of. So this is a starting point, so it kind of defines colors and gives you sort of a bit of a preview of what the theme of your application is going to look like. So if I was to drop into here and actually change what the primary color would be, you'd see that reflected through all of the pages here, so that you can see how your changes to your theme colors is going to be impacted on the various layouts. Next thing is that we've got the actual theme page. So this goes just a little bit more detailed. So it provides all of the colors in sort of one spot to allow you to see how they're going to work against each other. You can go ahead and make changes to things like typography, sort of elevations in terms of heights and shadows. There's also a bunch of things around icons and things like the way that your icon or app icons are presented. So this is quite a useful page in terms of just working out the style pattern for your application. And then we just drop into components, and these are components that are known to work well with the Uno platform. And so you can go in here and look at the different variants. Now, this isn't a page where you're going to necessarily modify these, but it gives you an idea of what all of the variants are going to look like. We'll see in a second how you then make use of those, by you can drag them across from the Assets tab onto your page that you're working on. The next thing down is preset components. In the latest Toolkit version, I think this is going to be renamed to templates, but the idea here, these are preset components or preset groups of components that you can basically take as a group and basically drop into your application design. The big difference here is that components are designed to link back to the component definition. So, when you drop a button onto a page, it's actually linked back to this button. So if you do want to override the behavior, the look and feel of it, you can make that change here, and it will flow down to all of the various pages within your application. However, preset components are designed to be detached. So once you've dragged or copied one of these preset components onto your page, you actually detach it from the underlying page that's laid out here. And that allows you to then control the layout on the individual page that you're working on. Speaking of which, let's actually take a look at the sample app that comes packaged with the toolkit. And so here you can see it's a sort of a very sort of commerce orientated. So, you can go look for deals and products. Click on the details and actually see the full information, and then you can go about adding things to your cart. So this design sort of template gives you an idea of how an app would typically look. If you want to get started with your own, from the Assets tab, you can do things like you can start off with a page, and there's a sort of a template for a mobile orientated page. You can drag that onto your design surface, and then you can go look for things like a button. And you can drag that across. So I can grab the build button and just drop it onto there. And from over here, I can then go and modify some of the behavior of that. Actually, I'm sorry, let's just grab the other button, which is this one here. And you can see that you can toggle the icon. You can change the actual style of it to filled or outline, and that will determine the look and feel on the page. So you're not modifying the underlying type of button, like the actual the overall look of the button. You're basically just toggling some of the parameters there. And so when we export this into XAML, those are configurable options that get emitted as properties on the XAML. Okay, let me just go ahead and remove this extra page. We're going to come back to this page in a little bit, because we're actually going to copy or extract the XAML out of these pages as we get into the demo. So the next thing we want to talk about is the themes library. Okay, these ship as a NuGet package. There are themes available for both Material and Cupertino. The Flutter theme is what comes packaged with the Uno platform. So if you go and grab either WinUI or UWP, and then you grab Uno platform for the other platforms. What you'll get out of the box is the Fluent design language. So this is the design language that Microsoft has shipped for Windows. And so, being a cross-platform technology that's focused on, bringing that Windows experience to those other platforms, the default style that you get is the Fluent style. Most of the particularly the mobile apps that people are building, they tend to favor the Material Toolkit, Material design language. So you can go and grab that as a package from NuGet, drop it in, import it into your resources, and then you can start to assign the various colors and styles to the individual components that you have. And similarly, you can do the same with Cupertino if you want your app to be styled like it belongs on an iPhone. Next up is the toolkit. So again, Microsoft's done a great job of building out WinUI for the desktop platform. Unfortunately, when we're looking at mobile apps, there are some very mobile specific controls that are just missing from WinUI. So things like the navigation bar and the tab bar, they just don't exist in WinUI, and so as such they don't exist in the default platform for Uno. And so this toolkit is designed to bring additional controls that one would expect from, particularly for mobile, to the Uno platform. And so, in the case of these, where, for example, the navigation bar, the toolkit provides a navigation bar for not just iOS and Android, but it is also there for Windows. Okay, so this is part of the cross-platform offering that's available on all platforms. And there's some other controls that you see on the right-hand side there. There's also a drawer, that's sort of a pop-up container from the bottom, and there's this auto layout control that allows it to your application layout to adjust based on the size and the style of your application. The next thing is the extensions packages. So this kind of follows on from the work that Microsoft has done around the Microsoft extensions. So this sort of provides implementation for things like dependency injection, configuration, so being able to pull configuration from app settings.json and other sources. It provides some wrapper around HTTP, so bringing in or registering endpoints and defining HTTP clients for specific endpoints. It provides some extensions around logging and serialization. And of course, things like environments and local support for some localization. So those are some of the default extensions that come part of the Uno extensions packages. And actually, as we'll see in a minute, there's an Uno extensions template that actually makes use of some of these components as well. Two of the extensions that are worth calling out are navigation. So the built-in navigation experience, because it's Windows, is based on a frame-based. So it's frames with pages that you transition between. Obviously, that doesn't work for all styles of applications. So a lot of applications have tabs, or you have a navigation view that determines what's in view. So with the navigation library is a way of extracting a lot of those navigation-orientated phrases and making it easier to write your navigation logic either in the code behind for the pages or in your view model. And so it provides a common abstraction for that. Next up is the reactive extensions. And so as much as we all love MVVM as sort of a code for do data binding, the reality is that model is getting a little tired, and particularly in view of some of the sort of the more MVU style to patterns that are around, where a user interaction drives a change to the underlying model that then bubbles up as a change to the actual way that the view is presented. And so that model doesn't necessarily fit well with data binding because the view model is designed to have properties that are mutable, as opposed to this sort of MVU pattern where the model is really immutable, and your data binding the ideal would be that you data bind to the updated model. And so the reactive extensions essentially provide this sort of data binding mechanism for an MVU style model through the use of generated code. So this is more complex and deserves its own dedicated session, but it is worth noting, and it's quite interesting for those who are interested in adopting a more MVU style based application. The next thing is the VS Code integration. And so as we saw at the beginning, there has been a lot of work to make sure that developers who want to make use of the UNO platform but don't necessarily want to target Windows using Visual Studio can do so using VS Code. And so right now that's well supported with things like code completion, hot reload, and doing a lot of the sort of the debugging step-through behavior that we know and love from things like Visual Studio. So let's actually jump back in code. Let's actually take another look at a different app template. So this time we're going to use the UNO app extensions template. And we're not going to use the VS Code extension on the end because we're going to run this in Visual Studio. So it goes through the same process. Again, if I'd switched to Visual Studio straight away, I could have actually used the template that's actually built into Visual Studio to actually do exactly the same thing. So here we're going to actually launch the solution file. So which will of course launch Visual Studio. And in much the same way as the previous template generated a solution with multiple projects, this one generated even more projects, okay? And you might be asking why. And the reason for that is that when we're typically building out an application, there are other projects that we would typically want to have in here. So for example, we have two test projects. So we have a test project that's essentially a unit test project. And then we have a UI test project that is designed to essentially launch the app and actually step through a number of tests to actually make sure to validate the behavior of your application. We also have a separate class library. So for example, our view models and our other sort of models are located in a separate class library. This is a net standard library, although a lot of the projects we're now doing would just bump this up to being a net 6 library. And of course, we still have our shared project. So this is our project down at the bottom. It's actually got all of our application files. So our app.xaml, it's got our main page, and it's got a secondary page that we can see the transition between the two. So let's just go ahead and run this on Windows. So I'm going to set that as the startup. For the time being, I'm actually going to unload these projects. And the reason being is that when you go to build and run, when you do a restore, it'll attempt to restore all of those applications as opposed to just the target that you actually want to build. So it just saves you a few minutes in terms of building and running your application. Let's go ahead and build for Windows. And we should see our application launch. So this is the exact same developer experience that you would get if you were building any other WinUI application. However, you will notice that we've got this sort of material looking style. So this template actually already brings in the material style. So particularly if you're targeting sort of iOS and Android, it automatically produces an app that's going to look like it belongs on those platforms. If I click on this, go to the second page, you can see that it transitions to a second page. You can see that we do have a sort of this navigation bar at the top. It wasn't so evident on the first page, so on this page, it's not that evident. But as we go to the second page where you see things like this back button appear, this navigation bar is designed to sort of automatically pick up whether there's pages in the back stack. So you as a developer don't have to worry about writing specific code for that. Okay, so what we're going to do is actually jump back to our Figma page, and we're going to actually borrow a couple of page designs from here. So we're going to use the search products and then the product details page, and we're going to use those to represent our main and second page in our application and just put a decent amount of style on them. So I'll click on this search product. I'll make sure that the actual page is selected, and I'm going to right click and go plugins, the UNO platform. So this plugin's got a number of neat little features, of which exporting the XAML is obviously one of them. This play button, so this preview, if I click on the refresh button and get it to actually preview the app, what we're actually going to see here is essentially a running version of this app. So on the left here, we can see that this is our Figma document. What we've got in the plugin is this Figma document has been, or this page in the Figma document has been generated into XAML. And then the XAML has been parsed and actually run as a WASM application. So this is basically a hosted WASM application within the Figma plugin. And so you can do things like you can actually put your focus into the text block and you can actually type in it. So it does have some interaction. The list is scrollable, etc. These buttons are all there. They're not wired up to any form of navigation because it is just a a preview of what the experience would look like. And of course, we can switch to the XAML view, and we can use that to basically copy out the XAML for this page. So we'll do that. We'll switch back to Visual Studio. Oh, wrong one. Let's just close that. Let's go back to our running app. And I'm going to bring up our main page, which currently doesn't have very much on it. It's just got that single button that was in the middle of the screen. I'm going to replace the grid with the contents that I copied out of the Figma document. Okay, so you can see here that it's just drops in a whole bunch of different XAML into here. There is a little bit of a build error here, so I'm going to do Control Dot, and it's basically going to assist me by adding a UNO material namespace. So whilst we've got a project reference to the UNO material, we need to import it as a namespace into our XAML so that we can use it. Okay, so let's just give this a bit of a run and make sure that the styling of our application has been updated. Okay, so yeah, as we expected, we've now got the search box at the top, we've got the buttons down the bottom, but we're missing a bunch of products in the middle. Okay, so we haven't written any code to actually source those products. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's just, we're going to make a use of a publicly available data feed to actually bring this in. But before we do that, I'm also going to make reference to the community toolkit MVVM package. Reason for this is it provides a very nice wrapper for, or implementation, I should say, for iNotify property change, along with some attributes that can be used to generate a bit of source code. The next thing we're going to do is actually go into our main view model, and we're going to copy in and essentially the information or the definition of a refit endpoint. So I'll come down to the bottom here, and we're just going to drop in a bunch of classes here. So essentially what we've got here is a dummy endpoint that's got so this is basically, it's got a single endpoint, so it's products, that's going to be surfaced up as a get products method. Okay, so it's just an interface. Refit's going to essentially generate the actual class for us that implements this interface. The response from this gets products is a product response that has a single item inside it called products. And as you can see here, the product is basically made up of things that you'd expect, like a name, a brand, price, and photos, etc. Okay, so let's just go and make use of that in our main view model. So we're going to change this so our main view model inherits from an observable object, which is part of the MVVM toolkit. And we're going to come down here and we're going to basically accept an iDummy endpoint into the constructor of our main view model. So essentially, we don't have to worry about where it's being instantiated from and stuff like that, because the dependency injection component that we have, courtesy of extensions, is automatically going to pass that endpoint into our main view model. Okay, we do need to worry about what we're going to do with it. So we'll do load product. We're going to pass that endpoint into that, and we'll let Visual Studio generate that method. Come down here, we'll change that to be an async task, and in here, we're simply just going to call the endpoint. Sorry, get products. So, and then of course we need to expose this as as something that we can data bind to. So we'll come up here and we're going to do observable property. And we're going to return a property called items. But to do that, using this observable property attribute, we're going to have a private field, which is essentially going to be an array of products, and it's called items. And the reason for that is because in our XAML, the item that we're going to be data binding to, or the data binding expression, is items. So we'll make sure that our model matches that. So down here, we basically need to assign a value to that. So we're going to do items equals response dot products. Now it's worth noting that this is uppercase items and this is lowercase. This is because the uppercase property is being generated off this backing field, courtesy of the MVVM toolkit. So that should be all that we need to actually launch or for our main view model to have a list of products available. There is a little bit of extra wiring up that we need to do to make sure that refit is generating the right classes for us. So if we come down to our app.xaml, This XAML host.cs is where the host or the is created for our application. So this is where things like environments defined, logging, and there's a spot down here where you can add your own services. And actually what we're going to do is we're going to say we want to use HTTP. So this adds things like some native HTTP handlers. And we're going to say we want it to, let's see whether it's going to generate my code. It's not. So I'm only using uno.extensions.refit. Should be included in there. Let's just see why it's not pulling that in. Interesting. Let's just try building that for a second. So the other, let me just try the other way of expressing this, which we know is the which normally does do the correct code completion for us. There we go. So that brings in the right namespace, but then I can get rid of that. Okay, so essentially we're going to use add refit to basically define what our endpoint's going to be. The only other thing that this really needs is going to be an endpoint defined in our app.xaml, sorry, our app settings.json. So let me just go ahead and define that. Drop that in here. So this is going to define what the URL of our actual endpoint is going to be. And now we should be in a position where we can essentially run our application. Okay, and to behind the scenes, as our main page is launched, it's actually going to pull back the list of items. Now, it would be really nice if clicking on one of these items would take us across to our second page. So to do that, we're going to employ a bit of navigation logic. So we'll come to our list view, and on here, we're basically going to say that we want our navigation request to be second. And you might go, okay, where's the second coming from? Well, if we go back to our host definition here, you can see that we've got a bunch of routes that are defined, of which the second one down here is called second. So this is for a view model called second view model. So that's how that the navigation system knows where we want to navigate to. The other thing we need to do is we need to communicate to it that it's going to accept a product. Okay, so we're going to change this from a view map to be a data view map that takes a product as part of it. The next thing we need to do is obviously update our second view model. So this is the definition on that over here. So right now this is an empty class. We're going to change this to be a record because we don't actually need any logic actually in it. And for this, we're going to take in a product, and that's all we need in our second view model. Lastly, of course, we need to show something on the UI, otherwise we're just going to navigate to a blank page. So we're going to start off with a text block that basically just shows what product we're going to be seeing. So we'll do binding to product.name, and we'll put this in the middle of the page. And there we go. We should be good to go. So let's go ahead and do that. So now what we should see is we should see a list of products that when we click on the product, it should take us to our second page. And as we go back, well, interesting. So one thing we noticed there, although it did it quite quickly, is that it actually reloaded the page. So it didn't leave us back where we were. And so, for example, if I'd scrolled down the page, if I'm now clicking on it and going back, it's actually going to reset back to the beginning of the page. So luckily, there's a bit of a fix for that. The other thing we're missing here is that we're missing any form of imagery that should be here. And again, on the second page, we're obviously missing the entire design of this page. So let's go and see if we can fix just some of these problems. So on our we'll start with the main page. So we're going to go here, and to stop it refreshing every time, we're going to actually change the navigation cache mode. And we're going to set that to required. Okay, so basically the navigation, the main page is going to stay in as it was as we navigate to the second page. As we come back to it, it won't be repopulated using this navigation cache mode. The next thing is that we're currently missing any images in our template, even though there is actually an image as part of this template. So, and that's because our data binding expression is essentially wrong. So we're going to change that to photos, and we'll data bind to the first of the photos that's available on our entity. Now, of course, our second page doesn't have any XAML on it. So for that, we're going to go back to our Figma document. And this time we're going to pick our product details page, which is across here. And with that in focus, I'm going to hit the refresh button in the plugin. And so that will generate some different code. And we're going to copy that again, come back to our this Visual Studio, this one, and we're going to drop this in place of this grid. Okay, so again, I'm just going to scroll up, make sure there's no build errors. Okay, there is. This rating control currently hasn't been added in. Okay, so I'll comment that out for a second, and I'm pretty certain I need to just add a namespace for this one as well. Okay, so now we should be pretty good to go. The only thing that we'll notice is that when we run it, it won't actually, the data context won't be correctly set. So what we'll end up with is a nice little looking page, but with actually no content in it. So, okay, so the images are now showing, which is a good sign on our main page. If I click through here, we've got the right design for our second page, but we've got no details here. Okay, so let's just go and fix that. And sure enough, as we come back to this page, it's actually maintaining the correct position on it. So we made some progress. Let's just go and fix our second page. And essentially what we see on our second page, if we scroll down, we've got things like an image. Okay, let's just correct that data binding as well. And we've got things like the name. Okay, but hang on. If we look at our second view model, we've got an object called product. Well, the product's got a name. So if we go to definition on that, it's got a name property, but the second view model itself doesn't have one. Okay, so what we essentially need to do is come up to the top here, and on one of these top elements, we'll actually say that we're going to change the data context to be essentially a derived element. So basically, we're going to say data bind to the product property on the second view model, and thereby the other data binding expressions are all going to be in relation to this product. So they should make sense now. Okay, so we click through all that, and there we have our image. Okay, so the image isn't scaling particularly well, but we've got some nice things like, you know, the title and the brand. The price needs a bit of styling, so let's just go and as our last modification, we'll come into here. Let's just go to our product, and we're going to add another property in here, so a derived property. So we'll mark it as JSON ignore, and we'll do public string formatted price. And this is a derived property, so it's going to be, we're going to take in price. Actually, we don't even need the brackets on that. We just basically do toPrice, toString, and use the currency converter there. So of course, in our second page where we are showing that, so let's just go and find the price in here. We want to change that to formatted price. Okay, so we'll give it a bit of a run, and hopefully that's nicely formatted as an actual dollar value now. Okay, so that's been nicely formatted, and we can make use of that in the other places where the price has been exposed. So with that, we're going to switch back to the slides. And so just talk about a couple of customers that the Uno platform's got. So there's a big array of different customers that are using the platform for different platforms. So for example, TradeZero is targeting, it's a consumer kind of experience. It's targeting the mobile platforms, but they've got an experience to basically take a plan to then take that to the other platforms like web and desktop. The NuGet Package Explorer, I'm sure all of us have spent way too many hours on NuGet, but so many people I talk to don't actually realize that the Package Explorer even exists. So let's just do uno.extensions.configuration here, click through to this, and over on the right hand side, you'll see this open in NuGet Package Explorer. So I'll click on that, and what this is going to do, so this is a Uno platform WASM application. And it's actually going to be downloading that package expanding it on the client side and showing you the content. So you can actually drill down, have a look at the contents. You can view the metadata about the sort of the package information. You can actually click on logos and actually see what they look like. So it's kind of like a really useful tool to know how your package or about a particular package. And there's things like you can see the dependency list and stuff like that. So it's a very useful tool if you want to sort of just drop down and actually have a look at what's included in the packages. But it is also an Uno platform build, and it was one that was originally started on Windows and then migrated to the web using the Uno platform. Another client is Kahua. And so they've got a WinForm, sorry, quite a large WPF-based application, and their strategy is to basically use the Uno platform to bring that to the web. And this is a relatively large enterprise sort of scale kind of application, and it's very performant on the web. The Uno calculator, so this basically takes the original source code from the Windows calculator and now makes it available across the entire spectrum of the Uno platform. Okay, so to wrap things up, so the Uno platform essentially allows you to take WinUI and make it available on essentially any platform that's able to run .NET, including things like the web. So you've got you can now use XAML to build an application that's going to look and behave properly on the web, rather than necessarily to write HTML and CSS. One of the big things about the web, though, is that if you do have a JavaScript component or some libraries or some CSS and stuff like that that you want to make use of, you can include that as part of your application. So libraries that are available for connecting to security or connecting to backends or whatever, all of those can be added in as JavaScript libraries for the web build. The idea, unlike some other platforms, is to provide a pixel perfect experience. So it doesn't matter what platform you're targeting, the UI should look the same on each of those platforms. And lastly, the call to go and have a look at is the Figma integration. And it provides a rapid way for designers to basically give you the design of an application and then extract the XAML to basically jumpstart the development of your application. So to get started with the Uno platform, go to platform.uno. Their team are available on Discord. And if you've got any issues, then you can report those directly to the GitHub repo or the repos, I should say. So there's the Uno platform core, that's just /Uno. And then there's the extensions, the toolkit, and the VS Code stuff as well. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I'll take any questions either from the floor or in the chat.
Brian, have you got a question?
Yes, always, right?
Yeah.
Can you hear us in the room?
It's a little soft, but yes, I can.
I'll try and speak up then. So you showed the Figma libraries for material.
Yep.
Do they have equivalent Figma libraries for if you're using the Fluent UI?
So currently they don't. The idea is they've got a little bit more work on the material library to do, and then they're going to be doing the same or similar for Cupertino and probably Fluent as well. So yeah, it is a starting point. And the one thing I would say though is that you can, I mean, you could change the styling on the material toolkit. So one of the interesting things that they are also doing as part of the work, both in the toolkit, the material library, and the Figma library, is that they are sort of rationalizing the various brushes and colors and stuff like that that are available across all of the platforms. So the idea is that when you define your application to use a primary brush, it shouldn't matter whether you're using material or Cupertino or Fluent. That brush should be used in the correct places for those different design languages. So the idea is that you're pulling out things like a lot of those design assets as things that you can define once, and then you can basically switch between the various themes and just decide on which theme you actually want to make use of. So.
I also have another question on the XAML generation from the Figma as well.
Yep.
I'm assuming that's working based on the components that build up all of these templates and everything. If you add your own little custom components to it, does that prevent you from being able to generate XAML, or does it just leave a big question mark block for you to code yourself when you're
Yes.
exporting?
So it doesn't break it. So typically, if you're bringing in your own components, they'll get rendered as very sort of basic elements, so like borders and grids and things like that, as opposed to the more complex controls. So the guidance is for sort of things like buttons and stuff like that, it would be advised to stay with the components that are defined. But if you're just, adding like a grey background on an element and you want to do that, you can just drop in a regular element and it will work. And it would just get generated as a border or a grid. So yeah, look, the teams.
I have more.
Sorry, what was that?
I'll say I'll let someone else go with more questions, but I have more.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, it's just that the team are definitely looking for feedback on the Figma tool. So if you get started playing around with it and you do have questions or you've got feedback on how it's working for you, the team are definitely interested in that. Even though the first version came out a year ago, it is still deemed to be in preview because it's definitely a work in progress that they're trying to, we're trying to get the best experience for that sort of developer designer handoff. So yeah. Yeah,
looks really impressive actually. The Figma integration is compelling.
Nick, you talked earlier about WinUI. I think from what I've read, there's different versions of WinUI. So which one?
So this is
here?
Yeah, so this is WinUI 3, which is the version of WinUI which is extracted the XAML out, or the XAML engine out of UWP. So Microsoft's gone through this evolution where UWP is the sort of the platform framework for building Windows applications. And so they've taken the sort of the application framework part of that away from the operating system and made it available as WinUI and packaged it as this WinApp SDK. So essentially you're building a Win32 based application that has the ability to use WinUI XAML, so XAML and C#. So to answer your question, the two main versions are WinUI 2X, so I think the latest one's 2.8 or something like that, and WinUI 3. So WinUI 2X is designed for being used inside a UWP application. WinUI 3 is designed to be used in a WinApp SDK based application.
Yeah, is there support for video controls, like for streaming video at all?
So that there is definitely for rendering video. The streaming side, particularly with DRM, I would have to double check. I'm not sure where the platform is on that. But I think just general like normal streaming stuff is fine. DRM becomes a little bit harder because there are some native platform components that need to make that happen, particularly on Android. So there's always some issues around that.
Okay, I've used Avalone before, and video was one of the things I had to be careful of because it wasn't implemented on every platform. Are there similar caveats, I guess, in Uno that you need to be careful if you're picking out controls?
Look, I'll be honest, there are. So there are some edge cases where there are not controls. So particularly, and this is true of all of those cross-platform frameworks. So Avalonia, .NET MAUI, and the Uno platform. So things like map support. I don't think that map support's there in Net 6 at the moment. So it would, like, as part of doing sort of due diligence for which framework to use, I would definitely say, make sure you investigate those sort of more complex controls that you want to take advantage of, in the same way as you would third-party controllers. Look, I mean, there are some good third-party vendors that are supporting the Uno framework, but it would be worth making sure that your controls of choice are there. And if they're not, look, raise it with the Uno team, and so particularly if there's a control library that's available for UWP or WinUI, the team can basically reach out to the vendor and see whether we can get an Uno version built, because usually that's kind of a minimal amount of effort to get it to be cross-ported like that. So
Wait, that's excellent. Thanks.
I'm fairly new to cross-platform with .NET, so it's confusing me a little bit as to what would be the main differences between Maui, Blazor, and Uno.
So let's start off with the difference between Blazor and Maui/Uno. So that's the big difference there is that you're essentially building using web technology and then having it run within a native shell. So if you're talking about, Blazor for Maui, or I forget what they exactly call it, but essentially you're building your application as a web application, and then parts of it run natively. So the code behind does run natively, but it's still essentially using the sort of the Blazor framework for building applications. And so that's particularly useful if you have a Blazor website and you want to reuse that code for building out your mobile targets. In terms of the difference between Maui and Uno platform, so their approach to the way that they abstract the underlying platforms are different. As an example, Maui abstracts every platform and provides a common layer for all of them, whereas the Uno platform doesn't abstract on Windows. You're actually using the WinUI on Windows, whereas Maui provides an abstraction over the top of those. They also don't use the control templating for most of their controls. So it can, advanced styling and control templating is very new to the Xamarin Forms and Maui world. There are some sort of their newer controls that do support control templates, whereas the Uno platform is built from the ground up to support control templates. So it makes it very easy to change the look and feel of various elements, which is one of the reasons why it's easy for them to provide like a material and a Cupertino design language and have that applied. So they don't need to introduce new button controls or new text block controls, etc. So they're the same controls. They've just been styled according to the theme or the design language that you want to use.
So if you needed to develop a new application, what you would use Uno rather than Maui? Or?
I would, because I know that for most of the applications I'm working on, I want to make sure that I've got a web offering as well. And that's something that the Maui team are not going to provide, or at least have provided no indication that they will. And their alternative to that is using Blazor and targeting the other platforms. And so I feel that the Uno platform is probably my preferred one, but equally well, I know that there are other people that prefer the Maui approach. I think that there's definitely places in the market for everyone. But if you do want an application that's going to look identical on every platform without you having to put in extra legwork to make it happen, Uno platform is definitely the way to go.
Okay.
Hey, Simon.
Go ahead, Simon.
Hey, I was just wondering, do you get the choice of the 3 different rendering styles when you're targeting WinUI?
You mean in terms of the material, Cupertino, and Fluent?
Yeah.
Yeah, you do. So if you bring in like I showed in the second demo, if you that already has a reference to the material package as such, so uno.material, and as part of incorporating that, you get buttons and things that look like they belong in material. So yeah, it definitely out of the box, if you don't apply those, you'll get a Fluent looking application, the same as you do on iOS and Android using Uno. If you don't bring in those other packages, you'll end up with an app that uses the Fluent design language. But if you bring in material or you bring in Cupertino, your application on all of those platforms will look like they're styled for Android and iOS specifically.
Yeah. So. Does it do that by rendering all of those things from scratch?
No. So the underlying rendering is the exact same on each. Well, sorry, let me just take it back a step. So yes, the way Uno works is it uses the native underlying control. So there is essentially a button control there that has been restyled according to the platform.
Okay.
And then so that's the Uno level. And then on top of that, you then have the ability to style using Material or Cupertino. And so those aren't really a rendering, they're more just a change in style. So, rounded corners for Material, etc. Are all things that are being applied at the style level, not actually at the low level rendering side of things. So.
Okay, so it applies all of those styles onto the native controls.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Brian, you have another question?
I do.
Yes.
So you showed the development experience for Windows. How will it tie into things like the Android emulator and the dreaded trying to get it to run and debug on iOS?
Oh dear, yes. That well, it piggybacks on the same technology that Microsoft uses for Maui and Xamarin Forms and building, any Xamarin application. Because essentially, I mean, the Uno platform is piggybacking on the work that Microsoft has done. So in terms of, if you're building an iOS app using the Uno platform, you're either building a Xamarin iOS app if you're pre-Net 6, or you're now using a Net 6 iOS app. So that part comes from Microsoft. So the debugging experience on those platforms, including pairing to Mac and all of that, the associated technologies, is based on the work Microsoft's done. Now there is stuff that the Uno platform brings, so hot reload and XAML reload and stuff like that. It's stuff that they have brought to those other platforms as part of the Uno offering, but the underlying debugging capability for those platforms is what Microsoft ships. So we do run into the same challenges that Maui and other Xamarin developers run into. And I was laughing because I spent the last 2 days trying to get my pairing to Mac to work because Xamarin, so Xcode 14 isn't supported yet. So trying to connect and then get the simulators to work or the remote simulator to work just has been a bit of a bun fight, to say the least. So just for people who are interested, the workaround is to basically make sure that you have both Xcode 13 and 14 installed in parallel. And that will fix your ability to actually run or pair and then run your applications. The other challenge that you may run into, and particularly if you run a bunch of the previews for Maui and Uno for Net 6, is that you may need to go in and remove some of the workloads that have been installed. And so there's essentially a folder or two that's very specific to pairing from Windows to Mac that you need to remove. So if you kind of run into those, then feel free to reach out to me, because I just went through all of the last 2 days of pain to get that stuff to work. So
Yeah, I was experimenting with Maui and trying to get any iOS thing or the whole pairing to Mac. It was fiddly, and I never actually quite got there.
right. So the two things I would suggest is that there's a couple of folders that you need to that would, if you delete, will help it regenerate and set everything up correctly. But then if you are able to pair and you're not seeing the list of simulators in Visual Studio, then that's often associated with it having the wrong version of Xcode installed. So you just need to download from the Apple site the old version of Xcode. So I think the latest is 13.4. Grab that one, and when you run it, if you go to Preferences, Locations, you can actually tell it that you want for the command line, you want the Xcode 13 to be the preferred version of Xcode.
Xcode 10.
Question at the back.
I wanted to ask about the packet size for, like, when we deploy the app for Android and iOS. Will it be fairly large, like Xamarin app, or is it going to be smaller compared to those ones?
So it is definitely going to be larger than your native application. So if you use Xcode to build an Objective-C or Swift application, it is going to be larger than those. And so that is one of the trade-offs of using these cross-platform technologies. You shouldn't really see, the team's done a lot of work to make sure that they perform well. So in terms of, they should perform well in terms of they are a native-based application. So, transitions, startup time, those sorts of things should still be relatively good. And, you know, in the next 6 timeframe, we are benefiting from all the work that Microsoft's doing around performance for .NET MAUI, in terms of, you know, the compiler technology and the you know, the launch speed and stuff like that for .NET 6. The Uno platform benefits from all of those benefits, all those changes as well.
All right, I think we all have questions here. Don't see any more online. Well, thanks, Nick. Appreciate you joining us this evening.
No worries.
I've certainly seen a few things new to me that I need to go and look up a bit more about, but it's great I'll get there. And yeah, really great to see how far the platform has progressed over the last few years as well. So.
Yeah, well, hold your breath. They're about to do another drop. I think it's 4.6 is literally due out in the next day or two. That's got some pretty neat things like I don't know whether they're calling it XAML islands or not, but basically the ability to drop an Uno component or an Uno page into an existing, you know, WinForms or WPF based application. So, and the idea there is that if you, rather than necessarily having to transition your entire application away from those technologies, you can basically build parts or new components of your app using the Uno platform, and then you could reuse the Uno bits for iOS, Android, web, etc. So you can have this sort of, you know, parts of your application that's going to work for across all of the platforms, and then extends the existing WinForms or WPF based application. So that's some pretty powerful work. Microsoft kind of started this work back in with UWP and having be able to insert UWP components into WinForms and WPF based applications, and they're in the process of doing the same with the WinApp SDK. So there's some work underfoot to allow sort of content islands, which I think is what they're calling it, to essentially surface up WinUI components and pages within an existing WinForms or WPF based application. So.
Well, launch is pretty soon. We might have to have you back again next month, I guess.
Indeed.
Well, thanks, Nick, and yeah, thanks very much, and yeah, well, appreciate your time this evening. So
no problems. Look, feel free to reach out. My email's in the chat. It's just nick@builttoroam.com. So happy to take questions or provide some guidance if people are getting started with it. So.